se ha percibido en el extranjero y cuál es el aporte que esta Constitución y esta práctica constitucional ha podido hacer al derecho comparado. Entonces vamos a comenzar con Sergio, luego con Richard y luego con Ross. Cada uno va a hablar 20 minutos y al final pues yo intervendré para recopilar algunas de las consideraciones que ellos han hecho y sobre todo para moderar la ronda de preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, sin más prolegómenos, le doy entonces la palabra a Sergio para su intervención. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Es un gusto estar acá. Sobre todo, muchas gracias por la invitación. Es realmente un placer y un gusto estar junto con grandes amigos y tremendos académicos como Ross, Richard y Carlos. Voy a hacer, de acuerdo a las instrucciones que recibí previamente, voy a hacer mi presentación en inglés, de manera de poder formar un diálogo con Ross y con Richard también. In this presentation, I will briefly explore how it should come to no surprise that the 1991 Colombian Constitution has attracted the attention of non-Colombian scholars, judges, and policymakers from many jurisdictions by looking at two specific Colombian themes that have been important for the field. First, constitution making, and second, the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine. Even though the range of materials that scholars from abroad access is limited, as it is for most countries that are not part of the usual suspect list of jurisdictions that scholars are more interested in exploring, such as the US and Germany, Colombia has certain advantages over some of its neighboring countries. First, Colombia has internationally focused law schools like Los Andes, Externado, of course, Savannah. It is normal for their professors to study abroad, to organize activities with foreign scholars, to write in 8 volumes and international journals. Many of them also write in English, and some of them become internationally recognized scholars in the field. Scholars like Catalina Botero, Carlos Bernal, also junior scholars like Vicente Benitez, they're all active members of the international scholarly community. The ICONES Colombian chapter also is probably one of the most lively chapters of that important academic association. The trend of legal academia in Colombia also draws from the reputation of local legal journals. If you take a look, for example, at Scopus, Colombia has 3 law journals indexed as Q3 or above. In this type of indicators, it is common that Colombian legal academia typically appears ranking higher than countries like Argentina, Peru, and even Mexico, and closer to countries like Brazil, which has a giant academic market. Colombia also has interesting institutions, such as an active constitutional court that is constantly, with good or bad reasons, pushing the limits of our traditional understandings of usual power. And there are also many important political processes that are attractive for jurisdictions facing similar challenges, such as the peace agreements. So I will focus on only 2 specific themes, but it's important to take it into account that comparative scholars are also interested in other aspects of the Colombian Constitution. Examples include the way judges have engaged and constrained emergency powers of the president, women's rights, the Constitutional Court's tutela mechanism, its experience enforcing social rights, the Colombian version of the block of constitutionality, which is very important for scholars studying the Inter-American human rights system. Looking at the 2 themes that I selected, I will argue that even though there is much to learn from Colombian constitutional law, particularly in those themes, the use of ideas originated in Colombia can also be subject to some of the problems that many times inevitably arise when using comparative law methodologies. For that reason, I need to say something about borrowing and migration of constitutional ideas. It is important to highlight that the dark side of legal transplants and constitutional borrowing is not unique to Colombian constitutional exports. Comparative legal scholars have long studied these problems, from Alan Watson's Historical and Cultural Warnings to Comparative Law, to Ross Dixon and David Landau's recent book on abusive borrowing. The migration of constitutional ideas has been influenced by the existence of a broad catalog of alternatives that are at the disposal of actors that use items from foreign jurisdictions to justify actions that can become costly for crucial democratic institutions. The use of borrowing can be cynical and selective. Comparative elements can be recycled to justify morally flawed legal arguments, often at the expense of the rule of law or the democracy. They can be used to defend policies whose consequences are far away from the legal effects that were expected in the original places. Unfortunately, Colombia has also been a victim of this. Even if the intention of those actors are well intended, there are still challenges that are hard to overcome. Gunther Frankenberg has claimed that constitutional items circulate like marketable goods among the participants of transnational legal debates. This includes policymakers, legal scholars, judges, and others. They give place to a globalization of constitutional items, but we are yet to understand how those items are taken from one place to another and how they are recontextualized. So now I will speak how this has happened regarding the Colombian model of constitution making, and then how this has happened regarding the Colombian model of the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine. So regarding the constitution making process, the Constituent Assembly, the Colombian Constituent Assembly, has been considered by many as a model. In the Latin American context, perhaps along with the 1988 Brazilian Constitution, the Colombian Assembly has been generally considered successful in achieving a democratic and consensus-building procedure that succeeded to replace the Constitution. Even if not perfect, the process is admired for procedural and substantive reasons. Procedurally, it unlocked serious legal limitations. It showed an incredible leadership, and it was sufficiently inclusive. Substantively, it achieved the purpose of creating a competitive and reasonably inclusive democracy. For this reason, people like former President Gaviria, Manuel José Cepeda, and others can be put in the Hall of Fame of successful constitutional leaders. The Colombian Assembly is often contrasted with the experience of Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, all processes that were subject to the pressure of a dominating political coalition that tried, with more or less success, to become hegemonic. Berajano and Segura's papers, for example, comparing Venezuela and Colombia, is now considered a classic in the field of comparative politics if you want to consider which models can be superior to others. The Colombian process succeeded to navigate the complicated waters that included, on one side, the revolutionary narrative of constituent power, and on the other side, the necessary mechanisms for consensus building. For this reason, outside of Colombia, the process has been highlighted both by scholars that believe in an unlimited revolutionary power that grounds its power directly on popular sovereignty, and also by scholars that advocate for a post-sovereign model of constitution making that can ground its legitimate results in a multi-stage process composed even by an elite-driven approach to the process. An example of the first group of scholars is Manuel Garretón, who have long called for a constituent assembly in Chile following the lesson of the movement of the Séptima Papeleta. He emphasized the idea that the court should not put limits to the constituent power of the people, such as the Colombian Supreme Court did at the beginning of the process. On the other side of the street, we find the word of Andrew Arato, who has argued against constitution-making processes that use the sovereign model and promoted instead a post-sovereign model that finds the legitimate reserves in the idea of a multi-partisan agreement, among others. The post-sovereign model is compatible with the idea that some people using the ideas of Sieyès and Schmidt can find anti-democratic, such as the elite-driven bargaining process, or even the interim constitution that can set constraints to the process. In his last book, though, Arato found that some features of his model were present in the Colombian constitution-making process. The point here is not to say whether Arato is right or not, or whether Garretón was right or not. The point is to emphasize that opposite schools of thoughts about constitution making that are often rival have tried to use the Colombian experience to justify their own normative agendas. This says a lot about the benefits of the Colombian process considered as a whole, but it also warns us that emphasizing parts of the process can risk use the Colombian model in a biased way, by only selecting the parts that justify a specific agenda. We should be careful about this kind of uses. A recent example comes from the ongoing Chilean constitution-making process. The Colombian model has been used by many in Chile. President Gaviria, Manuel José Cepeda, and others did landmark speeches in Chile. The Library of the Chilean Congress created a document detailing the Colombian process's features, and many public intellectuals and politicians have invoked the Colombian process. Some have used the Colombian model to argue in favor of simple majority rule and to say that Chilean courts should not be involved in the process. As scholars advocating for these ideas tend to oppose the government and do not believe in a consensual constitution-making model, but on a majoritarian and popular model, they omit certain facts. They do not say, for example, that President Gaviria was involved in the process, that the agenda setting included a shared presidency with 3 individuals, that the procedure included a doble lectura, and that there was a deadline and default norms for regulating the procedure. As they disagree with using these elements in the Chilean context, they select the elements that serve their agendas and push for them. On the other side of the struggle, we also find people that have used the Colombian model to argue that a double revision criterion is necessary and that agreement among diverse factions is desirable, even though they omit the fact that the Colombian model involved an initially illegal process that was although sanctioned by courts. As the people from that side of the struggle also wants to emphasize the need for legal continuity and advocate for the idea of the process as constrained by substantive limitations, they prefer to ignore the way the Colombian model balances the competing values of popular sovereignty with reasonable political constraints aimed at producing a consensual constitution. There is much to learn from the Colombian process, but borrowing without adapting is not a good idea. Scholars should be considered the accumulated effects of the Colombian process and be able to design a procedure that suits the needs that non-Colombians are seeking to satisfy. Even if comparative law is necessarily instrumental and the way it can serve to strategic politicians can be far from the best methodological practices, scholars and constitution makers should be aware about the limits of the lessons that they can gain from foreign experiences. So now to the second theme. The second theme is the substitution doctrine, the famous Colombian doctrine. This doctrine is typically cited along with the Indian basic structure doctrine as one of the successful examples of in the realm of unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrines. As a scholar that is interested in what happens in Colombia, I am aware that there are strong criticisms against this substitution doctrine. But unfortunately, critical approaches against the Colombian doctrine are harder to find outside Colombia, perhaps with the notable exception of the work of Carlos. I have looked at papers published in Spanish in Argentina and Chile engaging with the substitution doctrine. I have only found a couple of critical papers of the doctrine written by non-Colombian scholars. In the English written literature, however, this situation seems to be even less critical, even though the attention that the doctrine has produced in the global constitutional conversation is high. For example, the doctrine now has an entry in the Max Planck Encyclopedia of Comparative Law. There are also historical articles published in English journals by authors like Mario Cajas, Vicente Benítez, and others. And the doctrine has served to build the basis of different fields in comparative constitutional law. Most of these works, though, are driven by only one case, which is the famous case that prevented former President Uribe from running from a third presidential term. But they rarely engage with other cases. This Uribe case has been used, for example, to justify judicial power. Samay Sakharov, for example, cited it as a tremendous achievement that prevented democratic erosion. David Landau used it for his famous theory of abusive constitutionalism. Ross Dixon and David have a very famous and a very good paper on the utility of this doctrine for transnational purposes. And the substitution doctrine also has become an important lesson for people interested in presidential regimes. I think the argument is well captured by Carlos Bernal's paper published in ICON. Carlos Bernal, Carlos will correct me if I'm mistaken, but he's very critical of the theory. But there's a normative space for defending the theory in a narrow way that is defended in that paper on the basis of the abuses that hyper-presidential regimes can have. Another literature that is very important for this is the literature on term limits. Mila Versteeg and her co-authors, for example, in a paper published last year in the Columbia Law Review, used the Uribe case to claim that it is the only case, according to their data, that where a court has ever successfully stopped an evasion attempt. There are other cases that haven't been successful. So this case is truly unique, and that uniqueness has drawn the attention of scholars. There's also a literature that uses this case to explore how courts can behave strategically to defend their power within the political regimes. Kind of in a game theory approach. We have a paper by Ross Dixon and Samay Sakharov about judicial deferral-based strategies. I have also written in this field using this case. And then we have the theory of constitutional change, which with scholars like Richard Albert, Janet Rosnay, that tend to cite this case and the theory also. And then we have Joel Colon Rios, who has cited the theory to call the attention that the Colombian Constitutional Court has cited explicitly the work of Carl Schmitt. This can be subject to many criticisms, of course, but it's something that is very interesting for people working in constitutional theory. I think it's a bad thing. We can discuss it, but it's an interesting thing. But the Colombian doctrine has been misused, and I just want to give two examples of how the I just want to give to finalize my presentation with two examples of how the Colombian doctrine has been misused by non-Colombian judges in courts outside of Colombia. So the first is in Bolivia. the Constitutional Court of Bolivia in 2017 declared the unconstitutionality of the term limits of President Morales and other officers. The challenged clause was not included in a constitutional amendment, but in the original constitution that was enacted in 2009. The ruling was justified on different arguments, and one of them looked at Colombia. One could think that the Bolivian judges would look to the way judges in Colombia have dealt with the constituent power, though Bolivian judges were not interested in that. Instead, they used the Colombian doctrine on the block of constitutionality as evidence to the claim saying that international human rights law has shaped the local legal systems. For the Bolivian court, the Colombian court has developed similar accounts as those of Italy and France, and they cite a book published by the Universidad de Medellín. The idea behind construing a strong block of constitutionality doctrine in Bolivia was aimed at justifying the superiority of international law over constitutional law. The trick was that the Bolivian judges interpreted the American Convention on Human Rights as protecting the incumbent president's political right to be re-elected. This last conclusion is, of course, flawed. It can be subject to strong moral, legal, and democratic objections. The second example happened last year in Chile. The Chilean Constitutional Court in 2020 declared the unconstitutionality of a constitutional amendment. In the context of the pandemic, legislators were trying to placate the economic consequences of the pandemic by introducing a transitory disposition to the Constitution, authorizing the individuals to withdraw part of the savings accounts that were originally designed to fund their retirement pensions. There were many arguments against this bill. The Chilean Constitution states that changes to the social security system can only be initiated by the president. There was a discussion on the correct supermajority for approving constitutional amendments to the transitory part of the Constitution. Some people thought that the amendment harmed the right to social security, which can only be amended by a higher supermajority. Behind the conflict, there was a politically salient problem. President Piñera was trying to control the agenda to engage with the pandemic, and legislators from the opposition were trying to impose their own measures. The court, which is composed by a majority of judges that are sympathetic to the current governing coalition, so sympathetic to Piñera, accepted the claim and declared the unconstitutionality of the amendment. Though the reasoning was confusing and flawed, the arguments seemed to all have been accepted, but in the end, none of them was. The arguments seemed to be contradictory. The precedent was deeply flawed. The court just cited whatever was useful to support its decision. The court even cited scholars like Yaniv Rosnay, and they also cited Ross and David's paper on the transnational use of the doctrine. However, the court did not use the democratic argument, even though they cited that literature, nor it built a theory on the constituent power. It still cited the Colombian substitution doctrine and reproduced literally some paragraphs of that doctrine, but it never showed how the implicit limitations of the constituted powers can be found. So it never really used the test developed by the doctrine of Colombia. These last two examples show that the opportunistic citation of the Colombian doctrine served the purpose of hiding a dubious argument that did not make any sense in either the Bolivian case nor in the Chilean case. All the examples, including the ones of constitution making that I cited before, confirm that the Colombian constitutional law has traveled. Scholars are interested in it, judges cite it, constitution makers consider it. This is a reason of pride for Colombians who have built a constitutional system that has served as a worldwide experiment for many reasons. But, and this is a big but, Colombians could do the world a favor if they also engage more with the ways their doctrines have been imitated or discussed around the world. If Colombia is going to be part of the usual suspects list, as I think it will, at least in Latin America, then it is desirable that we provide the world with the necessary resources to understand Colombia well, so that the misuses of the Colombian doctrines can be identified. People like Carlos Bernal, David Landau, and others have played a crucial role in this. Comparative scholars could use more people like them. Thank you.
Sergio, muchísimas gracias por esta maravillosa presentación que nos has hecho con un repaso exhaustivo de la doctrina, también en inglés, que ha prestado atención a varios aspectos del derecho constitucional colombiano que comienza con la Constitución de 1991. Te agradezco mucho esta brillantísima presentación. Y ahora quisiera entonces darle la palabra a mi amigo y colega, el profesor Richard Albert, quien nos habla hoy desde Austin, Texas. Muchas gracias. Richard, please, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Carlos, and hello to everyone. Thanks to the University of La Sabana for hosting this program, and I want to thank in particular the two organizers, Gabriela Gonzalez Nino and David Ramirez. Thanks for putting all this together from behind the scenes. And of course, my dear friend Carlos, thanks for moderating. And to my friends and colleagues on the panel, Roz Dixon and Sergio Verdugo, so good to see you and to have the chance to learn from you. Let me just note, for those of you who haven't not yet seen Roz's new book, this is it. Can you see it? I can't see myself on camera, so you tell me if you can see. Great. This is the latest book, and I recommend it to you all. This is the first of two books that you'll soon see from Roz at Oxford University Press. And so congratulations, Roz. And also congratulations to Fabio Enrique Pulido Ortiz, the director of your master's program in constitutional law. I understand that you're now celebrating your 10-year anniversary. So congratulations to all of you, and in particular to Gabriel Mora Restrepo, the founder of your master's program. And one last word, which is a word of welcome back to Colombia, to a dear friend, Vicente Benitez, who's been away completing his doctoral degree, but now he's back on your campus, and you're lucky to have him back. And so congratulations to all of you, and Vicente, great luck to you as you return to full-time teaching. I'm grateful for the invitation to join you all today to mark the 30th anniversary of the Colombian Constitution. This is a fun opportunity for me. And for me, it's a reminder of why I love my job so much. It's a job I get to do here on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin, which is located on the indigenous lands of the Tonkawa. Their stewardship of these grounds has really given me a great life, a life of learning and discovery. And so I honor the Tonkawa, and I ask you to join me in doing the same. My inclination on this day, a day when we gather to commemorate the 30th anniversary of your Constitution, my inherent predisposition is to express my congratulations to all of you and to all the people of Colombia. But I think that would be the wrong way to meet this moment, this anniversary of the Constitution, because why congratulate a country and its people because their constitutional text has endured for 3 decades? Perhaps it's because the average lifespan of a constitution is roughly 20 years, and Colombia has now exceeded that number by 10 years. Maybe that's a good reason to celebrate a constitution. Or perhaps it's because we just like to celebrate round numbers, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Each of these decades of constitutional endurance is perhaps worth celebrating because the Constitution is marking a new milestone each time, taking new steps further. But that just leads me back to the first question, which is why celebrate the endurance of a constitution? There must be, I think, something beyond a round number, something beyond a long lifespan, something more than just years in the bank that causes us to wish to celebrate a constitution. So I will not say congratulations, at least not yet, because I'd like to explore with you whether there is good reason to celebrate this constitution on this anniversary. And the way I propose to do that is by asking a question, which is, has the Colombian Constitution fulfilled its promises to the people of the country? That's how I think we can evaluate whether a constitution is worth celebrating on an anniversary like this, 30th anniversary. So I want to begin by focusing on 3 sets of promises in the 1991 Constitution. 1, the promise of transformative constitutionalism to expand rights and freedoms, especially social and economic rights. 2, the promise of participatory democracy to invite Colombians to take a larger role in self-governance and in shaping the country's democratic commitments. And 3, the promise of working toward reconciliation with indigenous peoples in Colombia. So let's start with social and economic rights, because this is a central promise in the 1991 Constitution. Article 1 defines Colombia as a social state that is based on respect for human dignity and on the work and solidarity of the individuals who belong to it. Article 2 continues by declaring that the essential goals of the state or to guarantee the effectiveness of the rights stipulated by the Constitution. These are lofty and noble words that open the doors to the Constitution. These promises paint a vivid and colorful portrait of what the Constituent Assembly thought could be possible for renewed Colombia. And so the question for me presents itself, which is, has the Constitution delivered on these promises? Let's just consider a few examples of some of the most important social and economic rights in the Constitution. The right to shelter, the right to a job, the right to form a union, the right to equality, and the right to a clean environment. Article 51 says that it's promising the dignity of a home to all Colombians, and that the state commits to creating public housing and to giving effect to a right to shelter for the people. And yet, the Administrative Department of National Statistics in Colombia reports that 42.5% of the total population lives in poverty. The Ministry of Housing reports that 30% of all families in the country do not have adequate shelter, and over 660,000 families are homeless. So that's one promise the Constitution has failed to fulfill. What about the right to a job? Article 25 declares that every individual is entitled to a job and that work is a right. This is another area where the Constitution has failed to deliver. In 1991, the unemployment rate in Colombia was 10.1%. Today, it's 50% higher at 15.4%. On another labor right, the Constitution has likewise overpromised and underdelivered. Article 39 guarantees that workers have the right to form trade unions. But the 2019 Global Rights Index, published by the International Trade Union Confederation, shows us that there is a long way to go before Colombians enjoy this right to form unions, a right promised by the Constitution. Colombia is on the list of the 10 worst countries for the rights of workers. Other countries on this list include Algeria, Guatemala, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, and Zimbabwe. What about the right to equality? Article 13 is rooted in a promise to eradicate inequality, especially as it relates to economic equality and wealth redistribution. But here too, the Constitution has failed to fulfill its promise. Just consider the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of economic inequality in the countries of the world. Today, the Gini coefficient in Colombia is the 13th worst in the world, and that's pretty bad. It's bad now, but it was also bad at the creation of the Constitution. 1991, the Gini index for Colombia was 51, and today it's the same, 51. So the same or similar conditions of economic inequality persist and unchanged. Let's look at just one more example. This is the right to a clean environment, which is protected in Article 79, which says that every individual has the right to enjoy a healthy environment. And it explains that the state has the duty to protect the environment. Again, this promise has not been kept. In 1991, there were 1.5 metric tons of CO2 emitted per capita. Today, Colombia is doing worse. That number has risen to 1.6 metric tons. In 1991, there were 126 kilotons of greenhouse gas emissions. Here too, Colombia is doing worse today. That number has risen to over 184,000 kilotons. One more illustration. In 1991, 75% of all electricity came from renewable sources in Colombia, and today that number has dropped to 68%. So promises made, but not kept. Now I want to stress that it may sound like I'm picking on Colombia, but I'm not. Colombia is not alone in making constitutional promises that remain unfulfilled. In every country in the world, there is a gulf between the written constitution and the actual lived, political, real constitution. No country delivers on all of the promises that its constitution makes. And it's not always because of bad intentions. I don't think the problem in Colombia is bad intentions. It may instead be that the Constitution paints a portrait of an exceedingly optimistic vision of what is possible. That might be what is happening. Because the Colombian Constitution is an aspirational text that's rooted in a distinct approach to constitutional governance, which is transformative constitutionalism. Transformative constitutionalism does not satisfy itself with simple statements of government structures and negative rights. It does more, at least tries to do more. It speaks broadly and boldly and ambitious language. It rejects the existing limitations of society as it is today, and instead reaches far into the future to envision society as it could be. And so it seeks to transform society. And that's why it makes a commitment to delivering social and economic rights to the people. For instance, the right to housing, to food, a job, minimum wage, paid holiday, all of these things, these rights that are intended to give every person a meaningful life of safety, stability, fulfillment, and affirmation as a whole person. You see, it imagines all that is possible for a good life, for a just society, and for a constitution that's committed to the people that it serves. All of this, of course, sounds great. But as we've seen, the 1991 Constitution has not fulfilled its transformative potential for Colombia. In many cases, the Constitution enumerates what so far appears to be an unrealistic set of promises, yet to be fulfilled, and perhaps not soon to be fulfilled, maybe never to be fulfilled. And I think there are serious consequences for a Constitution that makes promises that it fails to deliver. Because if a constitution enshrines the right, for example, to a healthy environment, but the state doesn't have the funds to clean the environment, well, that right might as well not be written into the constitution because it's toothless. Just like the Constitution of Bolivia, as an example. Article 16 promises the right to food to everyone, an admirable objective, of course. But 20% of Bolivians are undernourished. There's a gulf, you see, between what the Constitution says and how the people live. Or the Constitution of Mexico. Article 123 declares that equal wages shall be paid for equal work, regardless of sex. Well, today in Mexico, there's an enormous gender wage gap of about 20 to 25%. The point is just this. It's that constitutional promises really mean nothing without political action. Constitutions, we all know, cannot on their own guarantee rights because political actors have to build political will and have the fiscal discipline to deliver on the promises that their constitution makes. And it's a good idea to follow what the Constitution says because there are risks and real costs involved when a constitution says something, but it really does another. I think it risks evaporating from the constitutional text a lot of its substantive force, and with it the hope for cultivating a people that abides by and respects the rule of law. Now, I think as Colombia marks the 30th anniversary of the Constitution, this is a problem that the country has to confront. There are real doubts not only in Colombia, but outside of Colombia, about whether transformative constitutionalism is possible in Colombia. But there are signs of progress, I think, in the country. Today, political participation is more robust in Colombia than it was before, and this is a central promise too in the Constitution. The preamble envisions a democratic and participatory framework for self-governance. Article 2 pledges to facilitate participation by everyone in the decisions that affect them. And Article 40 declares that citizens have the right to participate in the establishment and the exercise and control of political power in many ways, including voting for representatives, running for office, starting political parties, and other avenues of civic engagement. And so over the years, political participation and political culture both have improved significantly in Colombia. Today, Colombia ranks 46th in the world and 7th in the region on the Democracy Index, and it earns higher scores for political participation and political culture than it did 15, 20 years ago, when Colombia ranked 67th in the world and 11th in the region on both fronts. So that's good progress. And it's also true that the Constitution has, in fact, delivered on some important social and economic promises too. And perhaps the two most important from my reading have been on the right to health care and the promise of reconciliation. These two are obviously different kinds of rights, but it turns out that they're closely related in how they came to become so robust. I'll say a word about that in a moment, but first on healthcare. Article 49 stresses that public health is a public service for which the state is responsible, and it guarantees, or at least it promises, that all individuals will have access to services that promote, protect, and rehabilitate public health. Well, healthcare has improved considerably in the past 30 years. Individuals today have better and more reliable access to healthcare services, and the entire healthcare system has been modernized in an effort to make good on this promise that the Constitution makes. And on reconciliation, the Constitution contemplates a right to participation for Indigenous peoples in Article 330. Article 330 explains that national resource development, for example, must not impair the cultural, social, and economic integrity of the Indigenous communities. It also adds that for any decisions on this subject, the government will encourage the participation of Indigenous peoples. Now, I'm myself particularly interested in this subject of reconciliation because we're grappling with this at the moment in my home country of Canada, so I follow developments on reconciliation in Colombia quite closely. So back to Article 330, the language is key. It is that government will encourage the participation of Indigenous peoples. But encouraging participation is not a guarantee of participation. Here's the interesting part. Today in Colombia, Indigenous persons are guaranteed the right to participate through a prior right of consultation. So today, Indigenous peoples have a meaningful right to prior consultation on natural resource development, on laws and programs that affect their interest. And how did that come to be? Well, first, it's important to note that this itself is a transformation from encouraging participation to constitutionally guaranteeing prior consultation. Same thing with the right to healthcare that has now been made real. Now, both of these items trace their transformation from paper to practice to the Constitutional Court. It was the court in both cases that transformed the promise on paper into the reality of a right. As I noted earlier when discussing the gulf between what the Constitution promises and what it actually delivers, I stressed that these promises mean nothing without political action. That constitutions alone, we of course know this, alone cannot guarantee rights. And on both healthcare and Indigenous reconciliation, the court has led the way. And in doing so, I think it served as a model for many parts of the world. Many foreign courts have learned from the Colombian Constitutional Court's case law on healthcare and Indigenous reconciliation. Canada, certainly, I can tell you, India, South Africa, just to name a few. I think this is something in which to take pride. That the Constitutional Court has created a body of case law that is now useful to the democratic and democratizing world. This is, of course, not the only area in which the court's case law is well known. There is a substitution of the Constitution doctrine, a subject of global interest at the moment. We can certainly discuss that later on in the time for discussion, discuss whether it's a badge of honor, this doctrine or something else. But I want to just, as I close, take a step back from the details of the court's case law, because it's worth asking whether the court is the best actor to implement the promises in the Constitution. Because perhaps there's something lost when a constitutional community relies on a court rather than on its elected representatives to shape the content of public policies promised by the Constitution. That may be something worth discussing too. For now, I just want to raise the question whether the Constitutional Court of Colombia is just too powerful. And on this point, I think it's worth recalling an observation made by our moderator, Carlos Bernal. Writing for the blog of the International Journal of Constitutional Law, Carlos invites us to reflect on what we lose when the court becomes too powerful. Here's Carlos, and I quote, "In Colombia, the court is becoming the target of interest groups that, by means of strategic litigation, want to achieve an advancement of interests that in a constitutional democracy, after broad deliberation, should be openly balanced by the legislature with other competing interests. This, if the court continues to rise in power," Carlos suggests, "this could weaken representative, participatory, and deliberative democracy. Elected authorities," Carlos continues, "could lose incentives to undertake societal changes that the court will undertake on its own. Citizens could prefer," Carlos continues, "could prefer litigating rather than mobilizing, and political deliberation could constrain itself to constitutional argumentation. End of quote. That, I think, is worth discussing. I'd be very interested to hear how Colombians respond to this important point, I think, from Carlos for now. For now, though, I'm going to close by returning to the question that I asked us to consider at the very beginning. Has the Colombian Constitution fulfilled its promises? In some important ways, yes, and in some equally important ways, the answer is an emphatic no. That's, of course, the nature of constitutions. They can't do everything, certainly not at once. Some things take longer than others. So, should we celebrate the Constitution of Colombia on its 30th anniversary? I think we should celebrate its success in improving political participation, in democratizing access to healthcare, in accelerating reconciliation, particularly in relation to the indigenous right to prior consultation. But I think we should worry about just how far Colombia still has to go to make good on the unfulfilled promises in the Constitution. It's true that transformation takes time. On the one hand, we might say that it's only been 30 years. On the other hand, we might say it's already been 30 years. So how much longer must Colombians wait for housing, for a job, for a clean environment? Because it's possible that the social and economic rights promised in the Constitution will just never come to be. And what happens then to the Constitution? What happens if this wide gulf between the promises made and the reality lived still persists in 2041 when you all gather again to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Constitution? I wonder if you'll still celebrate it. I wonder if some of you may think that it's time to rewrite the Constitution, perhaps to remove these promises because you may conclude that they're now empty promises. Because by then, perhaps, it will have become clear that those promises just cannot be fulfilled. We're not yet at that point, fortunately. And for now, 30 years, I think, is something worth commemorating. And there are certain parts of Colombia's constitutional jurisprudence that have traveled the world and helped other countries improve the lives of their residents. And I think that part of the Constitution of Colombia, that is certainly worth celebrating. Thank you for inviting me to join you today in conversation. Looking forward now to learning from Roz and then to our conversation thereafter. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Richard, por esta maravillosa presentación que habla de uno de los temas más interesantes que puede haber hoy día, y es sobre si las constituciones en realidad pueden transformar a las sociedades. Yo quisiera permitirme decir solamente una frase en inglés para que Richard me entienda. Just one sentence in English, Richard, and it is that maybe with the economic and social effects of the pandemic, that gulf between the Constitution and the reality has become greater or bigger in all the countries in the Americas. That's one thing that also the constitutionalism has to deal with in the coming years. Uno de los puntos es que esta distancia entre la Constitución y la realidad quizás se ha hecho más grande por los efectos económicos y sociales de la pandemia que se han vivido en América Latina, sobre todo, de una manera muy fuerte. Y ahora pues quisiera dar la palabra a Ross Dixon, y sé que vamos a aprender muchísimo de las enseñanzas de Ross. Richard presentó uno de los libros recientes de Ross que salió hace muy poco en colaboración con el profesor David Landau, sobre los préstamos constitucionales abusivos. Es un libro maravilloso. También va a ser traducido al castellano y al portugués, publicado en una serie que yo codirijo en Marcial Pons en España y en Brasil. Y el otro libro que se llama Responsive Constitutional Review es un libro maravilloso. Yo creo que es un libro que todo el mundo está esperando. Yo ya tuve el privilegio de leer un manuscrito muy adelantado, quedé impresionado. Así que desde ya le recomiendo a los lectores estar pendientes de la salida de ese libro. Ross, I give you the floor. Thank you so much for being this afternoon with us. Thank you.
Gracias, Carlos. Like Richard, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to this wonderful conference from traditional Aboriginal land and pay respect to the Wurundjeri people, and thank our hosts at the University of La Sabana It's a real delight to be here via Teams, joining so many of you for a celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Constitution in Colombia, but also joining colleagues at Sabana for an important virtual conference. It's especially important, I think, for us in a world where the pandemic has made travel more difficult to connect in this way virtually, and to celebrate the court and the Constitution in Colombia as a deeply important model of democratic constitutionalism, and to think about it in critical and comparative perspective. The importance of connecting in this way cannot be underestimated. I'm especially delighted to be on a panel with three very good friends and people who've influenced my thinking in this area. Carlos used to be, before his time as a judge on the Constitutional Court of Colombia, a professor in Sydney, and he taught me so much about Latin America and comparative constitutional law. He hosted a conference at Macquarie University where he invited Richard Albert and David Landau to come. Richard ate very healthy snacks, David ate very unhealthy ones, and they arrived at this conference. And I got to spend time with both of them, getting to understand their work and ideas. And from that time, I've had a long-standing co-authorship with David Landau about comparative constitutional developments, including this book that people have generously cited to on abusive borrowing, but also broader work on the unconstitutional amendment doctrine and social rights. And Richard and I have had a long dialogue about amendment and worked together with Sergio in the international context in ICONS, and in a way that has really enriched my career. So all three of the people on this call are some of my best comparative constitutional law friends and have taught me so much about what I know. And but for that conference that Carlos started and instigated, many of those friendships and collaborations might not have happened. So I think it is important that we continue to meet, even virtually, and make these connections. There are many young scholars in Colombia whose names I recognize on the chat, and I am delighted to be joining you. Please feel free always to email me and make connections aside from this conference. I'm always delighted to learn about what you're working on and to learn from you. When we meet in 30 years' time, I promise that I will give the talk in Spanish, even if it is terrible Spanish. One of the things that I have benefited from in joining meetings in Colombia and Chile in the pandemic is that every time I understand a little bit more of the Spanish, and so in 30 years, I hope that I will be able to show more respect to you as my audience and speak in Spanish. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about this book that Carlos has generously introduced, Responsive Judicial Review, and suggest that the Colombian Constitutional Court, for all its failings, has been actually an emblem of responsive judicial review, that it is actually one of the leading courts worldwide in adopting and advancing the particular conception of judicial review that I think is democratically desirable and attractive. In saying that, I'm going to highlight three cases from the court: the IDP case, the first and second re-election cases, and thirdly, the series of LGBTQI rights cases leading to same-sex marriage recognition, but particularly to 7C 577 of 2011. Those three sets of cases, I suggest, are exemplars of responsive judicial review that are worthy of praise and notice by a comparative audience. When we talk about the reception of the Colombian Constitution abroad, I think it is fair to say that the Colombian court is a highly noticed and studied court in Latin America. Sometimes, as Sergio says, for the good, and sometimes in ways that are perhaps too superficial and insufficiently critical, that the court is used in ways that David and I might indeed call abusive in nature, if not, then at least in ways that are insufficiently critical. But it is interesting to me that the court remains underappreciated in the truly global sense as a model in ways that part of my book seeks to counter, which is
Creo que Ross se desconectó. Let's wait for her to reconnect. Esperemos un momento a que se reconecte. Mientras tanto, pues permítanme pues agradecerle a la audiencia por estar esta tarde aquí. Yo veo a algunos amigos y colegas de la Corte Constitucional aquí también conectados. Here we have some audience from the Constitutional Court, Richard y Sergio. Y pues yo también quisiera decir, pues es muy interesante la conversación hasta ahora, cómo se ha trazado y los puntos de vista tan originales que ustedes dos han traído a colación. Algo que me parece muy importante de las cosas que dijo Richard tienen que ver con también un tipo de estudios que se han venido produciendo últimamente aquí en Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, en el libro que también lo citó Sergio, de Mila Versteeg, sobre la realidad de los derechos, sobre si los derechos en realidad son capaces de cambiar la realidad, que tienen que ver con esta idea de Richard de si las constituciones en realidad logran o no transformar a las sociedades y cumplir sus promesas. Eso es algo que yo creo que en Colombia nos hace falta muchas investigaciones al respecto. Creo que Ross, you are here again. Casi. No sé si Ross se pudo conectar.
So I was saying that part of my concern is that we are insufficiently aware that the court is not understood globally as a model. So Carlos was also at a conference along with, I think, Manuel Cepeda in Sydney, where we engaged with people in South Africa and Asia who were not as aware of the Colombian model as I think they ought to have been. So even as we adopt a more critical and careful approach to understanding the Colombian model within Latin America, I suggest there is still work to be done in explaining and spreading an understanding of Colombia in its strengths, as well as its weaknesses that Richard so usefully highlights in the rest of the world, in both the global south and the global north. So let me talk about 5 basic dimensions to the theory of responsive judicial review that I believe are highlighted in the IDP case, the re-election cases, and the marriage case of 2011 in particular as exemplars of responsive judicial review. My account is one that does not seek to provide a comprehensive account of how courts should do judicial review in all cases, in all circumstances, but rather how they should interpret open-ended provisions where there is constructional choice with a view to promoting democracy. And in that context, my first argument is that unlike John Hart-Ely, who some of you may be familiar with, courts should seek to counter 3 broad risks to democracy. First, the risk of what one might call anti-democratic monopoly power, or the accumulation of an institutional or electoral monopoly. Second, what I call blind spots of perspective or application or accommodation, failures by the legislative branch to realise the full ways in which constitutional norms may be impacted or accommodated in a particular case. Thirdly, burdens of inertia, failures of the legislative branch to keep pace with evolving democratic understandings in ways that are reflected in the law. And that courts can play a useful role. As Richard said, they are not the only branch. The people and other branches of government, including 4th branches, can play a useful role, but courts can play a useful role in countering all 3 of these sources of democratic dysfunction or blockage in certain circumstances. Those circumstances are basically 1, under conditions of judicial independence, 2, under conditions of civil society and structural support for litigation, and 3, in circumstances where they have adequate remedial power. All 3 of those conditions are ones in which the courts have some control. They can develop their own remedies, they can build support for their own civil society support structure in ways that people like David Lander have suggested, and they can engage in review in ways that buttress independence. But they are also partially exogenous conditions that must be met in order for responsive judicial review to take place. The other possibility is that judicial review will be weak or ineffectual, or even, as David and I have suggested in our article, abusive judicial review, counter-democratic or abusive in nature. So that is the first argument. The second argument is that even under these conditions where judicial review is possible and democratic reinforcing, there is a risk to democracy from judicial review of this kind. This is the danger that Carlos's work alludes to and that Richard has so succinctly and beautifully captured in talking about the importance of popular and other modes of constitutional enforcement and transformation. The first risk is one I call reverse burdens of inertia, where courts make decisions that do not command majority support. Majority views are reasonable, and yet there are limits to the ability of the legislative branch to reverse or modify court decisions. That is what I call a reverse burden of inertia. Secondly, court decisions may attract backlash, and democratic backlash need not be reasonable, but it can still have a powerful capacity to undermine the rule of law and the capacity for the court to enforce constitutional requirements. Thirdly, even the best constitutional decision-making by courts that is neither likely to attract democratic backlash nor reverse burdens of inertia may cause what Mark Tushnet calls democratic debilitation. The degree to which the court doing all of the work of good governance, for example, in the social rights domain in Colombia, undermines the incentives for the political branches and the executive to develop their capacity and willingness to engage in constitutional implementation and transformation. Courts, I argue, need to take all three of these risks into account in performing their democracy reinforcement function. They need to balance, if you like, the three potential upsides to judicial review and representation reinforcement with these three dangers and downsides. Thirdly, what this translates into is a mix of doctrinal implications. It suggests a fairly carefully tailored approach to constitutional construction and implication that considers legal legitimacy, but also the political legitimacy of implications and the degree to which they, A, counter the risks of monopoly, blind spots and burdens of inertia, but B, takes into account the dangers of reverse inertia, backlash and debilitation. So the Chilean example, for instance, that Sergio points to is a doctrine made out of relatively whole cloth. It doesn't have a strong degree of legal legitimacy. So the question one would then ask is, well, what degree of political legitimacy does it enjoy? Is it a response to an urgent and systemic risk in terms of inertia or blind spots? The answer is likely no. Does it prevent democratic erosion or erosion of what Landau and I call the democratic minimum core? Equally, no. So again, we might see a relatively weak claim to legitimacy at the political level for that decision. And it does create quite substantial reverse inertia risks. So on a responsive account, a decision of that kind would not only be an instance of potentially problematic usage of Colombia, as Sergio has so articulately suggested, but also an instance of overreach relative to a responsive benchmark. I suggest that understandings of this kind can usefully inform and calibrate doctrines of proportionality, so that ultimately the presence or absence of the risks to democracy I note, monopoly, blind spots, burdens of inertia, are ones that could either heighten or reduce the intensity of proportionality review. Fourth point, responsive judicial review in balancing concerns about benefits to democracy and costs of judicial review ultimately points to a weak, strong model of judicial review. Carlos himself has written about that, as have people like David and others in Latin America. And Richard's remarks in this presentation clearly gesture in that direction. But ultimately, what I suggest is that the combination of weak and strong review is very important. I said that in a 2007 article on South Africa and dialogue. and that the combination needs to be sensitive to the nature of the risk that the court is seeking to counter, and that the combination needs to be dynamic in nature. It needs to be attentive to the need to encourage democratic deliberation and leave space for it, and needs to be tailored to the specific form of blockage and its strength. One of the things I suggest that complements both a proportionality analysis and a notion of weak, strong review is some ultimate willingness to give greater deference to legislative action that is recent and reasoned over legislative inaction. That there is in some ways a differential standard of review that is semi-procedural in nature, that takes seriously recent reasoned deliberation as a reason for heightened deference. That translates in a range of contexts, I argue, to a kind of penalty default logic or structure. A willingness for the court to suggest that there is room for Congress to deliberate and decide, but if it fails to take up that invitation, that the court itself indicates that it will step into the breach and do something stronger in a remedial sense. The fifth aspect of my theory is one that I call responsive judging. It is the idea that courts themselves do not take their sociological legitimacy as given, but that they seek to build it through an appropriately responsive judicial voice. That is obviously part of remedies that seek to engage civil society, but it involves three other distinctive elements. One, a willingness to author opinions and choose the person who writes for the court in a way that is overtly mindful of who is most likely to be disappointed by the court's decision. So if we are expecting religious conservatives to be disappointed by a decision, we appoint a judge who speaks to those conservative constituents. If we expect the Indigenous movement to be disappointed and there is an Indigenous judge who has joined the majority, that judge is best placed to write for the court in a way that says to those disappointed, we hear you, we take you seriously, and we have engaged with your arguments with respect, even though we have been unable to uphold your claim. The second aspect is an aspect of tone, showing respect and comity wherever it is possible. Sometimes presidents and executive officials, Maduro, Mugabe, they step over the line in ways that make it impossible in good conscience to show that kind of respect. But wherever there is a doubt, to give the parties before the court the benefit of that doubt in tone, because by doing so, you perform respect in ways that are likely to elicit reciprocal respect. There is wonderful social science evidence that says if I trust Carlos, he will reciprocate and trust me. And courts can perform that same form of gift exchange or trust in how they talk about the executive and the parties before them. The third aspect is about narrative and combining stories and narratives that speak to the global as well as the particular. So there are 5 key dimensions to responsive judicial review, and all of them, I argue, can be found in the best and most celebrated decisions of the Colombian Constitutional Court, although not every decision of the court measures up to these 5 criteria. Taking first the IDP case. The case uses weak, strong remedies and engages with civil society in ways that do, in my view, take seriously the need to balance inertia on the one hand and the dangers of reverse inertia and debilitation on the other. The second re-election and first re-election cases as a pair, which Sergio has mentioned in his presentation, in my view do reflect a kind of strong, weak or weak, strong enforcement, where the court in the first re-election case articulates limits but chooses not to enforce them in that case, and then moves on in the second re-election case to enforce them in ways that then have greater legal legitimacy and have benefited from a shift in political conditions where Uribe's political support had declined and Santos had been able to develop his own independent political base. So that the delay between the first and the second re-election cases built legal legitimacy and political support for enforcing presidential term limits. in a way that I suggest is emblematic of the most desirable forms of weak, strong review in cases of risks of political monopoly. Third case, the decision of 2011 on LGBTQI rights. The court announces a broad rule around the need for accommodation and equality, but a weak remedy in the form of delay. But a remedy that is mixed, weak, strong, in that it allows notaries to step into the breach should nothing eventuate. And then, of course, ultimately the Congress doesn't act, and the court in 2016 follows up with a stronger remedy. That, in my view, is the perfect example of a penalty default structure, giving Congress the opportunity to act, but indicating clearly that if it fails to do so, the court will step in and step in more strongly in ways that may command less democratic support rather than more in Congress. So Congress had an incentive to act, which it didn't take, in ways that the court then followed through and enforced the fundamental commitment to dignity, equality, and evolving democratic understandings. So one of the things I suggest to you as you mark the 30th anniversary of the court and the Constitution is to celebrate the finest decisions of the court as responsive in nature, but not to confuse that with every decision of the court or all of the ways in which the court has enforced its constitutional mandate. Some cases under the unconstitutional amendment doctrine, like the civil service merit case, the marijuana case, are far less responsive in my view. Some cases involving individual tutelers and social rights, in ways that Carlos have written about, have a more capacious quality and a less responsive quality. So not everything that the court has done has been responsive, but its most emblematic decisions have shown the world how to do responsive judicial review in a way that I think is worthy of celebration and emulation and explanation to a broader global audience. So as Sergio invites you to adopt a more critical perspective of the exports of the Colombian experience to Latin America, I encourage Colombian scholars to export both a celebratory and critical understanding of the court's jurisprudence that is sensitive to the successes of the court in achieving a model of responsive judicial review that is the envy of the world, as well as the degree to which it has been less responsive and less dynamic and dialogic in other contexts. So that the challenge then is to provide an account of the court that is understandable to the world, but nuanced and critical enough to celebrate both its greatest victories as well as its weaknesses. And it's my absolute privilege to be part of that dialogue and to learn from all of you about the Colombian experience, as well as to learn from Colombia in theorizing and developing my own work on a theory of judicial review. Thank you, Carlos.
Profesor Carlos, no te estamos escuchando en este momento.
Thank you so much, Ross. Muchas gracias a la profesora Dixon por estas maravillosas ideas que trae de su libro, en el que desde luego la jurisprudencia de la Corte Constitucional colombiana y sobre todo estos casos emblemáticos juegan un papel crucial. Yo no quisiera acaparar el micrófono y por esa razón quisiera en este momento abrir la posibilidad para que cualquier persona pregunte. Yo creo que hay dos maneras para hacerlo. Una, la más simple, es la tecnología que tenemos hoy con Teams nos permite que quien quiera abrir su cámara y su micrófono y hacer una pregunta lo pueda hacer. Quizás es la manera más cómoda. Si la quiere hacer en inglés, háganla en inglés. Si la quiere hacer en español, yo con mucho gusto la traduzco al inglés y traduzco la respuesta. O Sergio también podría fungir como traductor. O la otra manera es, si no se sienten cómodos haciendo eso, pues podrían enviarle alguna pregunta a David al chat. Yo sé que aquí hay personas de la Universidad de La Sabana, hay personas de fuera de Colombia, personas de la Corte Constitucional. Yo creo que esta es una oportunidad única para preguntar a Sergio, a Richard o a Ross. Entonces quisiera en este momento abrir el micrófono. ¿Quién se anima entonces a participar? Entonces yo voy viendo aquí las manitos. David.
Sí, señor. Listo. Bueno, me gustaría dirigir una pregunta al profesor Richard Albert. Well, I am going to try to speak in English, so please excuse me for any mistake. Well, I would like to know if, in your view, is it possible to consider that the case law of our constitutional court have, in some sense, increased the meaning of the constitutional text at such degree that the same constitution seems unaccomplished because of it? I mean, if I say that what the Constitution was really trying to say is wider, thus the constitutional text itself could be seen as lacking efficacy or accomplishment. So that's my question, especially regarding, for example, social and economic rights.
Creo que es I think this is a question for you, Richard. I wonder if you can tackle the question.
Yes, happy to. I just didn't know if you wanted to put some other questions on the table for us to go one at a time.
I think we can go one at a time. Thank you.
Okay, great. David, thank you for your question. I understood you perfectly, so don't worry about that.
Thank God.
So may I repeat your question, and then maybe the others will want to join in. So the question is it possible to read the Constitutional Court's judgments as filling gaps in the Constitution? And I think with two consequences. One is a recognition that the Constitution as written was not complete. And two, that when the Constitutional Court fills in these gaps, this comes to form part of what we understand as the Constitution. On the first point, the gap filling, which has a negative, I think, connotation, the idea that the constitutional text as written was just not complete or didn't address the problems that maybe were envisioned, or maybe the problems weren't envisioned at all. This is a role that the Constitutional Court, I think, has played quite well. And I mentioned two areas. One was the area of healthcare, and the other was the area of indigenous rights, this idea of prior consultation. But there are many other areas in the history of the court's jurisprudence where we can make the same point, that when the court does intervene to give meaning to the text in a way that maybe raises a question about whether it's consistent with what the constitutional text says, I think we can celebrate that. We can also decry that. So one way to decry it is to say, well, the court is actually rewriting the Constitution when it's doing that. The role of the court is not to be an amender of the text or a rewriter of the text, but to be an interpreter, a faithful interpreter of the text. And I wonder whether the substitution of the Constitution doctrine is not an example of the latter. That is to say, when the court is actually adding to the Constitution in a way that wasn't anticipated. Now, I think we could say that historically, courts in Colombia have had a role in limiting the power of amendment. This was a role originally exercised by the Supreme Court, now by the Constitutional Court, but it's not clear from the text of the Colombian Constitution that the Constitutional Court should be exercising this power. On the other hand, the design of the amendment rules in the Constitution of Colombia may be read to suggest that the court has, in fact, the power to limit the authority of amending actors to invalidate an amendment. Why might I say this? Well, let's think of a paper that Roz and David Landau have written on tiered amendment rules. It's a fabulous paper, and one teaching that I get from the paper is that when you have a structure of tiered amendment rules, what I've called elsewhere escalating amendment rules, right? Different rules of different degrees of difficulty that apply to different parts of the Constitution, someone has to police the use of one rule as opposed to another in respect of a certain amendment, right? So if the Constitution says, if you want to use this amendment procedure to amend that, and you must use that amendment procedure to amend this, well, what if there's a debate about which amendment procedure must be used? The police person in that case, I think one can make a very strong argument that the police person in that case must be the court. And so when the court is exercising the power to invalidate, or let's say to review an amendment, the substitution of the Constitution doctrine, it could be, I think, justified on that ground, that because Colombia has 3 different procedures of amending the Constitution, the most wide latitude given to the Constituent Assembly, the court has to step in to figure out and to say when the limit has been breached. So I think, David, your question is a fun one to think about, especially in the context of the substitution of the Constitution doctrine, but we could also talk about it in respect of the right to health and others.
Muchísimas gracias, Richard. Thank you so much, Richard. I can provide an example of that. Is that in Ecuador, there is that model of escalation of rules, and the court has to say what kind of tier is the one that should be used.
Yes, and also in Canada. In Canada, we have 5 different amendment procedures, and the court is asked which one must be used to amend this particular thing. I think this is a consequence, I think, of the escalating model, of the tiered model of amendment design. And when the court does that, it's filling in the gaps in the Constitution.
Thank you so much.
But I think it is important to note that its capacity to do that in a pro-democratic way depends crucially on its independence, right? So that, you know, in Ecuador and in Venezuela, the court gave a free pass to the regime to use the lower tier when it should have demanded the higher tier. And, you know, you see it in Rwanda and various contexts. So that for those sort of tiered mechanisms or escalator mechanisms to make sense, and this is one of the points that David and I have made, and I draw out in responsive judicial review, is you need a degree of independence. Otherwise, the escalator tiering just becomes, you know, if it collapses into a lower tier that the regime can use. And so tiering and escalator models really do depend on judicial independence. And I think that the Colombian experience really shows, for that to make sense, there has to be a narrow window of time in which this kind of pro-democratic review occurs, which is once the change has occurred so that the court itself is captured or compromised, escalators and tiering don't make sense anymore. Unless, and this is the caveat from Ecuador, the people can rise up and show enough pressure to make the executive push, you know, back. And so Ecuador is actually an example where the tier was largely popularly enforced, even though the court had allowed for the lower tier to go through. Thanks for the opportunity.
I don't know if Sergio wanted to say something.
Sergio, por favor.
No, I think I pressed something by mistake, but I only wanted to reinforce Ross's point. In Bolivia, it happened the same as well. They used the tiered reform argument against democratic procedures. I think it was a case from 2011 or something. I need to double check it. But it was used. And the argument is this thing is revising the basic structure, so it go through a constituent assembly. But calling for a constituent assembly is just very, very costly for the incumbent regime. So they interpret that clause in very narrow terms, and it's basically never applied.
But Carlos, it doesn't have to be the case that when a court interprets which rule must be used, which procedure must be used, it doesn't have to be the case that what the court says is binding. So another model is to have a kind of advisory review, where the court can hear a claim that the wrong procedure is being used. And the court says, this is our advice, this is our reading, and then that may then in turn be used by political actors. Of course, judges are political actors, by other political actors to make the case in the political domain. And so it doesn't need to be the case that you have courts exercising this extraordinary power to invalidate an amendment or to say you must do this or must do that. One way of, I think perhaps it's consistent or not, I'd love to hear from Roz, may be consistent with the idea of creating a broader, more robust dialogue, is to have an advisory opinion that is then used by political actors. Now, there are prerequisites, of course, for something like this to work. You have to have a robust political culture. There has to be a strong opposition, many other things. But let's not just lay down our arms and all agree that it must be the case that a court has the power, should have the power, to invalidate an amendment.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias a los tres. Tenemos tres preguntas. Primero el profesor Vicente Benítez, luego la profesora Raquel Sarria y luego Jacobo Gómez. Por favor, adelante.
Gracias, doctor. And I would like to say hello to all the friends who are members of this panel, Rose, Sergio, and Richard, and Professor Bernal, of course. This is a great panel, and I have learned a lot, as always, from you. La pregunta es para, creo que es para Sergio, pero pues en general creo que puede ser para cualquiera de los otros dos panelistas y el doctor Bernal también, si quiere opinar y dar su perspectiva, sería también ideal. Y es sobre, digamos, Sergio, tú que mencionaste a Andrew Orato, él dice una cosa muy, creo que él lo mencionó en un foro en Chile en el que tú estuviste, él dijo algo muy interesante, y es que el único caso tal vez que él conoce en el que el poder constituyente poder constituyente primario es judicialmente reconocido fue el caso de Colombia con la sentencia de 1990, en la que la Corte Suprema de Justicia dice esto no es simplemente una asamblea constitucional que va a reformar unas partes de la Constitución del 86, sino que es una Asamblea Nacional Constituyente. Entonces, yo, digamos, en ese contexto, yo quisiera saber un poco, ahora que el proceso constituyente está andando en Chile, yo quisiera saber cuál es el rol del juez en ese proceso, digamos, constituyente. Digamos, una pregunta de la teoría constitucional es, ¿los jueces tienen algún rol o pueden hacer algo en los procesos constituyentes? Y claro, una respuesta tradicional es no, porque es el poder constituyente soberano y los jueces son poderes constituidos, etcétera. Pero parece ser que el panorama es mucho más complicado que eso, ¿no? Entonces quisiera saber si en Chile los jueces tienen alguna injerencia en el poder constituyente y si el caso colombiano frente a la intervención judicial en el proceso constituyente del 90-91 ha tenido alguna injerencia y si ha habido alguna uso estratégico, digamos, como tú lo mencionabas, de esa experiencia colombiana. Muchas gracias.
Should I reply or should I wait for other questions?
Adelante, Sergio, adelante.
Thank you very much, Vicente, for your question. Vicente is asking, what is the Chilean doctrine regarding the judicial power revising the constitution making process? And he referred to a lecture that Andrew Arato did, saying that the Colombian Constitution, that the Colombian Supreme Court in 1990 was the only court that has ever engaged in this theme in an ongoing process. I'm not sure if it's the only court. Other courts have also engaged with similar questions, but perhaps the timing makes that decision very important, especially regarding the project of that started with the Séptima Papeleta and so on. So it makes that case very, very unique. The issue in Chile was phrased before in the 70s for an amendment that President Allende at that time was trying to veto. It was an amendment presented by the opposition. Large part of the Chilean literature has been built around that case from the 70s, and that case basically uses the constituent power theory that the court should not, to claim that the court should not do anything, basically. And most scholars in Chile believe this. The issue rose again in a couple of cases in the 90s, but it was later during the Bachelet process that the scholars seriously engaged with the theme. And at that time, people like Fernando Atria, Fernando Muñoz, and other scholars, some of them cited the Supreme Court of Colombia in saying that the Constitutional Court of Chile should not revise the process that Bachelet was pushing for. And this was animated by an interview that the president of the Constitutional Court at that time gave to the newspaper. In her interview, former Chief Justice Marisol Peña inferred, implicitly, that the court could do something about the process. But in the end, the case was never judicialized. The Bachelet's process failed for other reasons. So then the question rose again when the politicians were designing the rules of the procedure for the current constitution-making process. The agreement they achieved is the following. the process has two kinds of limits: substantive limits and procedural limits. The substantive limits include respecting international treaties, human rights, judicial decisions, and the Democratic Republic, among others. And procedural limits include deadlines, the majority rules, and others. The procedural limits, if there are violations on them, there's an explicit clause that allow a minority of the conventions, a fourth of the constitution makers, to sign a petition to the Supreme Court, not to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court doesn't have any reputation right now, so the agreement was with the Supreme Court, in which a panel of 5 judges, if I remember correctly, elected randomly, because the Supreme Court of Chile has 21 judges, will solve the complaint. So there's judicial enforcement, external judicial enforcement of the procedural limits. We haven't seen any of these complaints now. Maybe no complaint will be present, but the rule itself can generate a political effect nonetheless, even if it's not used. Regarding the substantive limits, there's an explicit provision that says that there's no judicial review on the fulfillment of the substantive limits. And scholars are now discussing what does this mean. Does this mean, for example, that there are no limits at all? Does it mean that the limits that the convention will need to self-police its own limits, and in which ways? And whether maybe we should invite international actors also to give their opinions on this. There are many implications. This area is in a gray area, and it's being very debatable. But of course, this question, Chileans are also looking at other experiences. So, for example, what happened in South Africa with the Constitutional Court revising the final draft and enforcing the principles included in the interim constitution is a model that was also discussed in Chile, and many scholars have pushed for it, but it's a model that was not accepted in the end. So it was considered can be considered as a negative model. But there are many courts in the world that can be looked at. And I think the Chilean courts their doctrines are still very narrow, but what is happening right now could be interesting for scholars looking at them. If the Colombian case if the Colombian 1990 case of the Supreme Court is going to be cited in Chile, it's probably going to be cited for the substantive limits or for justifying not having judicial review on the substantive limits.
Maravilloso. Muchas gracias a Sergio por esta estupenda respuesta. I don't know if Richard or Rose would like to say something about that. Ok. Bueno, entonces vamos a la próxima pregunta, la profesora Raquel Sarria, por favor.
Doctor Carlos, muchas gracias. It's such a great honor to be here and met Professor Richard, Professor Ross, and Professor Sergio. I see you many times ago, so I'm very happy to be here. Haré mi pregunta en español y se la dirijo a la profesora Ross Dixon. He tenido la oportunidad de leer trabajos suyos y de otros autores sobre el tema de los remedios dialógicos. Y me llama profundamente la atención y lo he podido ver aplicado en sentencias de la Corte Constitucional. Pero hay como un rechazo de ciertos magistrados, incluso actuales de la Corte, que dicen que digamos que es un tipo de remedio que le quita poderes al juez, ¿sí? para poder como realmente cambiar, por lo menos formalmente, la realidad, ¿sí? Y que deja el remedio realmente es en poder de los poderes gubernamentales, que al final son los que tienen los recursos, ¿sí? De pronto, ¿cómo hacer, digamos, para poder convencer a estos jueces de utilizar los remedios dialógicos y empezar a que esto sea mucho más mayoritario en las sentencias, por ejemplo, de la Corte Constitucional colombiana? Y que luego de revisado, por ejemplo, el remedio dentro del proceso dialógico, si la autoridad gubernamental no da lo suficiente o lo que el juez entiende como proporcional para la protección del remedio, cómo evitar que eso se convierta luego otra vez en remedios fuertes y que eso nos vuelva a traer al problema de la ineficacia de las decisiones judiciales. Esa sería mi pregunta.
I wonder, Rose, if you got everything?
I got about 60%. So maybe let me restate it and you can add, please, Carlos. So the question is about dialogue and how to achieve a real dialogue that doesn't then lead to the court having too much power and dealing with questions of the incapacity and also failure of the political branches to act. Carlos, what else?
Yeah, the question is about dialogical remedies, whether the court should use dialogical remedies and how to convince judges to use, or judges of the benefits of the logical remedies when they think that the only way to transform reality is by means of hard remedies, orders.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the question and for engaging with the work in that way. I think it's a very hard and important question. So the question then is to start with, why are dialogic remedies better remedies, and then how to explain it to judges who might want to be more, old style in a hard or strong remedy paradigm. So the why is that to draw attention to this, two sides of the benefits democratically of judicial review in countering inertia and blind spots, but the dangers in terms of reverse inertia and backlash and debilitation, and that's the principled reason, all right? So how do I explain it to a judge? Well, part of my theory is you need to think of judges as both principled and pragmatic actors. So you appeal to their sense of principle by saying this is a principled decision that balances democratic advantages and risks to judicial review. And the pragmatic is to say to courts that there is a risk of strong review leading to backlash and to loss of faith in courts as actors. That's part of Richard's point, is if you cannot deliver, you lose faith. And also the debilitation point says that even if strong remedies succeed, because they do nothing to build capacity and encourage active engagement from the political branches, as judges, you will have to work too hard. You'll have to remedy every single deficiency that arises because you'll have done nothing to build a capacity for engagement and implementation. So the principle is to say to judges, this is the right thing at the level of constitutional principle. But the pragmatics is to say this avoids damaging loss of faith and criticism of the court, and also avoids overloading the court's workload so that it has to remedy every single failure and do nothing to promote the capacity for self-regulation in the departments that you are trying to engage with. So I think always with judges, pragmatics and principle, and in this case, I think both favour the dialogic approach. One thing I just want to highlight, though, that connects this very helpful question to Richard's earlier remark is that the way I see responsive review is a theory that combines dialogic review or weak strong review with a model of review that is less dialogic but pragmatically oriented to countering democratic abuse or abusive change and the erosion of the democratic minimum core. So, for instance, in your advisory instance, Richard, I think in general you don't want advisory only. You want the threat of coercion in the way that the first re-election case reserved. It says here is some possible limits. They're not here, but maybe in the future we will have to enforce them. And I think that it is a mistake actually to use the word dialogue in cases of potential abusive change, because there the court is the speed bump and the deterrent. They're the traffic cop waving the flag, not the dialogic partner. And that dialogue is the metaphor for blind spots and burdens of inertia. But speed bump and deterrent as counter to abusive change is the right metaphor for the cases that involve monopoly power of both the electoral and the institutional sense. And so I agree with Richard's idea of what I would call weak strong or strong weak review. So saying we're not going to enforce the limit here, but we are going to warn you that there are limits that exist, more than a purely advisory or dialogic approach to cases of abusive change. but thank you for the question. It's a really helpful opportunity to clarify and elucidate the ideas.
Many thanks, Ross. Sergio or Richard, would you like to say something about that? Ok, entonces le voy a dar la palabra primero a Luis Carlos Pinzón y luego a Andrés Balcázar. Luis Carlos, por favor.
Buenas tardes, doctor Bernal, Professor Dixon, Professor Albert, and Professor Verdugo. I'm very happy to be here. I will try to make the question in English, so I apologize if I make any mistake. I would like to ask Professor Albert about what tools do people have to control and reverse the decision of the Constitutional Court. I like to ask this question because lately the Constitutional Court has adopted decisions on deep disagreements of the Colombian society, for example, abortion, euthanasia, and marriage of same people sex. So I would like to ask what tools do people have to reverse, for example, those decisions or decisions that the people aren't agree with the Constitutional Court. I'm worried about what the Constitutional Court has said about tools, for example, and the constitutional referendums that are also under their control. So I would like to ask if that's not an alternative, what is the alternative that people have to control that decisions of the court? Thank you.
Richard, please.
Thank you. Good to see you, Luis Carlos. Thank you for your question. And I'm sure Roz and Sergio would like to comment on this as well. So let me just put some ideas on the table if I could and invite some reactions also from you, Luis Carlos. Many courts around the world are identified as supreme, right? The Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court of Canada. There's also constitutional courts, of course, but I want to make a point here, and it's a point that I think will identify a problem in Colombia. It's the same problem that we see in India, same problem that we see in Belize, same problem that we see in many countries where courts have the power to invalidate an amendment or a change to the Constitution, however we want to term it. A court doesn't become supreme until and unless it gets the power to invalidate an amendment, because if it doesn't have that power, then the answer to your question about how to change what the Supreme Court of the court has done is to amend the Constitution by reversing the judgment of the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court. In my home country of Canada, we can do this. If the court says something, we can change the Constitution's meaning in two ways. One, in the long way, and two, in the short way. The long way is to build a coalition, to win elections, and then to appoint persons to the Supreme Court, and then to change the law that way by interpretation. In Canada, we don't really have a politicized court in the same way that we do here in the United States, where I'm standing. But that's how we would change the Constitution, or by amending the Constitution to reverse what the court has said. This has happened in the United States between 4 to 6 times, depending on how you count what counts as an amendment. But there have been judgments issued by the Supreme Court of the United States where the people, as you say, political actors as well, have said, no, we don't like that judgment. And so we'll mobilize through the rules, the procedures of Article 5 to overturn that judgment. And so there's a proposal for an amendment, there's a debate, and there's a ratification. Then the Constitution is amended. That judgment that you suggest maybe is not liked is overturned. Now, what do you do in a country like Colombia or India or Belize where you cannot do that? You cannot amend the Constitution to overturn a Supreme Court judgment or a Constitutional Court judgment if the same body is constituted, because they'll just say, well, hang on a second, we just told you last week that you cannot do this, that this is unconstitutional. So here a couple of strategies come to mind. One is just to play the waiting game, because as you build coalitions and you win elections and you appoint people to the Supreme Court and you change your mind on the Supreme Court or the Constitutional Court. This happened in Honduras. So between 2008 or 2009 and 2015, 2016, the Supreme Court of Honduras changed its interpretation of what is amendable and what is not. And that's a change that the court did on its own. But it would not have been possible to do that by amending the Constitution. The second way that's possible in Colombia and in India, just to give some prominent examples, is to convene a constituent assembly that is seen as valid and legitimate and having the power to start afresh. So when the Supreme Court of India says that the basic structure doctrine prohibits this or that amendment, it's very careful to say not that this change is impermissible, but that this change cannot be made by an amendment. It leaves open and is quite clear that the change can be made by writing a new constitution. So the same thing I suspect is true in Colombia. In fact, the power of a constituent assembly in Colombia is that there are no rules. I guess it's a question, right, that we're debating now. But my own view is that there are no rules when it comes to what can be done by a constituent assembly. But you see, both of those answers, Luis Carlos, I'm not sure that they're satisfactory to you, because they both come with costs. One, because in the first, where you have to wait to reconstitute the court, the cost is time, and the cost is that you're living under a regime that you just don't agree with in terms of a certain rule interpretation of the Constitution. The other, for the constituent assembly route, well, the cost is that you have to start afresh and build a whole new constitution, and that comes with risks. Risks of failure, risks of not knowing which coalition will dominate. And so this, I think, is another reason why we should be very careful with the doctrine of an unconstitutional constitutional amendment, because it forecloses avenues of change, precisely like the ones you're pointing to, Luis Carlos.
Muchas gracias, Richard. I wonder if Ross or Sergio would like to say something about that. Okay, entonces, Sergio, por favor.
No, it's just that so I agree with Richard with the alternative strategies. I think are worth considering for someone that wants to overrule the doctrine of the court. Maybe there's an additional possibility that given the specialized centralized system of the Chalcedonian type court has been instituted in Colombia, which is basically to use the choque de trenes feature. Maybe it's easier to capture the Supreme Court rather than the Constitutional Court, and if that is so, which I have no idea if it is, one way would be to impact the Supreme Court, and then the conflict between courts will undermine the powers of one of the two. Of course, these struggles are many times not good in the long run for judicial power and for many other features, but I can see how strategic and opportunistic activists can use these different routes as well. The other thing that comes to my mind is all the debate that Americans had regarding all the literature on popular constitutionalism. So one of the interesting things about the literature of popular constitutionalism is that it triggered a debate on the institutional ways in which actors can influence the courts, also with legal theories such as departmentalism and so on. Even though popular constitutionalism is not a prevailing legal interpretation theory in the US, and nonetheless, there's a rich literature to be explored there that could be useful also in Colombia.
And one of the things I think is very interesting in that context is there is a renewed interest in that in the United States at the moment in light of the Biden Supreme Court Commission. And, you know, I have been very interested. I was fortunate enough to give testimony before that commission, and reading all the submissions, you'll find it very interesting repository of ideas about how within an entrenched system, I mean, an amendment in Colombia is a lot easier than in the United States, so it's still a possibility, but even without amendment, all the possibilities, whether it's appointment or dialogue or other mechanisms, it's a very interesting moment to think about the US is also engaging in this sort of debate.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Thank you much. Thank you very much, Rose. Algo que quisiera mencionar, something that I wanted to say about this for the Colombian audience is that here in the United States, in the New Deal, the number of judges at the court was changed precisely with the aim of changing the view concerning the New Deal.
So not changed, threatened to be changed.
Yeah, it was threatened to be changed.
And the threat is the fascinating part. And, you know, I think if one thinks about Colombia and the Fiscal Stability Amendment, in many ways it was the threat, not the actuality, that recalibrated judicial review. And so I think it's very important to note both what are the possible tools that can be used and threatened. Now, threats mean nothing unless they're credible. And so in some ways, what was fascinating about FDR is he really meant it in ways that maybe President Biden doesn't, but that even without the actual change, the threat of it had an.
Thank you so much, Rose. Bueno, Jacobo creo que tenía una pregunta, pero no la... Lo veo ahora con la mano abajo, así que le voy a dar la palabra a Andrés Balcázar.
Muchas gracias. So we're running out of time. I'm going to try myself to be very short. And I have two questions, which I'll try to make into one, which are addressed especially to Professor Richard Love and to Professor Ross Dixon, but I think that they are definitely related with some of the points that Sergio also stated in his conference. So, Dr. Albert, you pointed out in a very, let's say, crude or not diplomatic way how the promises of the Constitution of 1991 have not been achieved, and I think we all know that, though it's hard to accept. But the question is, how do you evaluate, or what do you have to say about the difference or the gap that also, the breach that also exists between what the court says and reality? Because you spoke about examples such as health, or I want to point out especially democratic participation. But, and this is where the question for Professor Ross Dixon especially comes out. Well, you can actually ask yourself, how is it that you say that it's positive that, or that we've had an advance in democratic participation when the court has the last word in almost everything? So how is that democratic, right? And I just add one more thing for Professor Ross Dixon. I don't quite understand, like, sorry to be so mean about it, please forgive me, but what's the use of having remedies where the court, let's say, invites the Congress to do something? Because it's actually, in the Colombian case, it doesn't order, it invites. But then whatever it invites actually becomes an obligation. And actually, as Luis Carlos just pointed out, something that cannot be reversed. So I'm not sure what the solution there is. How can that be not a remedy and not a strict control? That's my question for both of you. Thank you very much.
Can I go first, or you want to go first, Richard?
I was only wondering whether Carlos wanted to get the question from Jacobo on the table, since...
Yes, that's much better because we just have 1 minute. So, Jacobo, por favor, haz tu pregunta, and then...
Listo, lo voy a hacer en inglés. So, my question is really brief, is about the substitution theory. It was introduced in Colombia in 2003. So, before the introduction of the substitution theory, the way the powers work between them didn't have to worry about the Constitutional Court coming and saying, hey, you cannot do that. So by introducing the Constitution, by introducing this into the system, has the Constitutional Court done something wrong? Or maybe it did something wrong, but now we realize it might have been good. I guess it's that.
So I think the question of what is right or wrong is a matter of legal and political legitimacy. And I think that the doctrine has gained greater legal and political legitimacy over time. And I think it is applied in ways that are more or less legitimate. But my own view is that beginning in 2003, it gained increasing legitimacy, although variable legitimacy in application. And that is a contestable judgment, which we can debate if we have more than 1 minute, but it's something that I would stand by. In terms of the other challenge, I have very brief answers. The first is, how do I know whether something has actually worked and been pro-democratic? Well, that requires two things. One is to look at what's happened on the ground. And I'm much more optimistic than Richard that cases like the IDP case and decision C577 have led to actual change in terms of the rights of IDP persons and the rights of same-sex couples. Now, there are many gaps, but gaps do not prove the failure of the overall change. They prove the imperfection of the change. And the second is I have to show that there's a degree of democratic support for the assertion of dignity and equality rights in that particular way. And I believe that it is not clear, but there is a sufficient level of emerging opinion to support those decisions. I think the much more important question, and I see it as deeply incisive, not mean, is that dialogic remedies can be real and rhetorical. And the invitation to Congress to act where there is no scope for discretionary judgment about how best to act is not real dialogue, it's rhetorical dialogue. It is an exercise by the court in legitimation. And for dialogue to be real, there has to be real choice between same-sex marriage or civil union, between a public model of provision or public-private mix, between, you know, this number of milliliters of water and that number. There has to be real choice for dialogic remedies to be real rather than rhetorical. And part of what I am trying to suggest is that there has to be a greater freedom of action when the Congress acts than when the court just steps in and substitutes its judgment. So, for instance, if Congress had adopted meaningful civil union in the aftermath of C577, my argument is that the court should have upheld that, even though it would have preferred same-sex marriage for some period of time at least. That is the only way for there to be meaningful dialogue.
Perfect.
Thank you. I'll just add just a few short thoughts in response, Carlos, if I could, to Jacobo about the substitution of the Constitution doctrine. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't have a generalizable answer that cuts across all jurisdictions. I think we need to begin with the text of the Constitution. Does it authorize the power? Is it implied? Is it express? I think we can make a very strong case that it's implied because of the escalating tiered structure of amendment. I could also make a strong case in the other direction. It's much different from the Constitution of Albania or Turkey, for example, which say quite specifically, yeah, courts do have a power here to review amendments, but only with regard to procedural correctness. So I think we should take our cue from what the Constitution makers say, what they build. And where it's clear that the court doesn't have the power, then it should not exercise the power. So I don't have a generalizable answer. For Colombia, I think it's a question whose answer can go in either direction, whether it was constitutional or not for the court to do that. Andres, your question was about the gap between what the text of the Constitution says and the lived reality. And you asked, well, what about the gap between what the court says the Constitution means and the reality as to that? You also asked about what you perceive to be a tension between my claim that Colombia is now more democratic in a sense. I use the concept of political participation and also the term political culture, that it's better on those fronts now than it was before. The tension you see is because the court is so powerful. So how can there be these improvements if the court is really dominating everything? Well, I think there has been improvement from what I can tell. There is improvement in terms of electoral participation, who goes out to vote. There's improvements in the sense of political parties that are formed. improvement in the sense of an openness to debate, a commitment to democratic principles and values. That, I think, has been documented over the past 30 years. There are challenges in every country, but it seems that if you care about democratic participation, that the trend line is positive in Colombia. Now, there's always going to be a gulf, a gap between what the text says and what's lived, and there will be a gap between what the Constitutional Court says or the Supreme Court says and the lived reality of the peoples, because the court cannot, in most cases around the world, cannot implement its own judgments. It relies on the acquiescence, approval, endorsement of other political actors to do what they need to do. And if there is a delay in narrowing the gap between what the court says the Constitution requires and what is actually lived by the people, well, the gap may be explained in part, at least in part, by a perception by political actors that the court has overreached, or that the court has taken the wrong path. Because if they believe in what the court has done, elected officials have but one prime directive, which is to stay elected. And so if they see that there is a synergy, a resonance between what the court has done and what the people will appreciate, then I suspect that there will be an acceleration in the implementation of the judgment if the resources are available for that to happen. That's another problem in Colombia, is resources. You can say everyone has a right to health care, but if the infrastructure is not there to deliver it to everyone, well, it's going to take time to build. So I think these are two challenges that are facing Colombia, but all countries, even my home country of Canada, there's a gap between what the court says and what is actually lived by the people.
Many thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much to both.
¿Quieres decir alguna frase para terminar, Sergio, tú?
No, just thank you for everything. It has been a pleasure to be here. What a fun panel.
Perfecto. Entonces, pues yo quisiera decir que este sí que ha sido un maravilloso homenaje a la Constitución de Colombia por sus 30 años. Tener aquí a 3 de los más prominentes constitucionalistas y teóricos constitucionales del mundo. Estoy muy agradecido. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Sergio. Y a todas las personas que se conectaron hoy de la universidad, de la Corte Constitucional, de otras universidades, otros sitios de Colombia y de fuera de Colombia. Les doy mis sentimientos de gratitud y les deseo muy buenas noches. Gracias por conectarse.
Carlos, can I just say one thing? Just yes, one thing, 10 seconds, which I think it's important to do. The strength of the ICONS Colombia chapter is just remarkable. It really can be a model for the region and the world. And I want to make sure that we honor and thank Roz and Sergio for helping to lead that. They've inspired chapters all around the world to be built. Roz had a vision when she became co-president of ICONS to multiply chapters, and Sergio helped very, very closely to do the very same thing. So working together, Roz and Sergio are, I think, a big reason why the ICONS chapter in Colombia exists, why it's so well supported, and why it's just so strong and prominent. So thank you and congratulations to both of them. And also to the chapter leaders, obviously.
De acuerdo con Richard, así que muchas gracias también a Sergio y a Ross. Pues muchas gracias a todos, también a David por toda la asistencia, a Fabio por haber organizado este maravilloso evento del día, y entonces yo me despido y les deseo muy buenas noches a todos. Hasta luego.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias a todos.